There is a man sitting in a concrete cell in Waupun, Wisconsin, right now. He has been there for over 7 years. The same walls, the same dimensions, the same artificial light overhead that does not know the difference between 7 in the morning and 10 at night. The corrections officers who work the overnight shift at Dodge Correctional Institution, the ones who slide his breakfast tray through the narrow slot in his door before the sun comes up, who check on him through the reinforced observation window at 3 in the morning, who have watched him week after week, month after month, year after year, without cameras, without press attention, without a single journalist asking them what they actually witness. Those officers have started saying something that careful examination of this case reveals has never been properly addressed in mainstream coverage. They say he is not the same person anymore. Not in the way you might expect. Not broken down and weeping. Not violent. Not throwing himself against the walls or making the kind of noise that would justify a dramatic headline. Something quieter than that. Something that the professionals who study this field, forensic psychologists, behavioral scientists, researchers who have spent entire careers documenting what prolonged isolation does to the human mind, describe as far more disturbing than any of those things. This is not going to be a recap of what happened on August 13th, 2018. You already know what happened. That date does not need an introduction. You have seen the timeline reconstructed in every other video covering this case, and sitting through it again would be a waste of your time. What this is going to do is take you inside what has unfolded since the cameras went away, since the guilty plea was entered, since the sentence was handed down and the courtroom doors closed, since the world moved on to the next headline and left a man alone in a concrete box with nothing but time. If this is the kind of deeply researched, carefully sourced content you have been looking for, the kind that goes beyond the surface and treats you like the intelligent viewer you are, then you are in exactly the right place. This is DAV Crime Records. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because what is ahead in this video is something the standard coverage of this case has never properly examined. To understand where Chris Watts is right now, psychologically, behaviorally, and institutionally, you have to start with who he was before any of this happened. Because the distance between that version of him and what the people observing him today describe is not a small gap. It is a chasm. And measuring that distance is the only way to understand the full weight of what documented sources are now reporting from inside that facility. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina. By every external account available from people who knew him growing up and into adulthood, he presented as unremarkable in the most specific sense of that word. Not troubled, not volatile, not someone who raised flags. Quiet, agreeable, conflict avoidant, to a degree that people who later analyzed his psychology found significant. He did not express anger in visible ways. He did not push back. He accommodated. He smiled when smiling was expected, and said the right things when the right things were expected, and the people around him largely accepted that surface as the complete picture of who he was. It was not. He met Shannon Rizuki in 2010, and they married in 2012. Shannon was, by every description from friends, family, and colleagues, someone who filled every room she entered. She had been diagnosed with lupus, an autoimmune disease that shaped her profoundly. Her resilience, her relationship with vulnerability, her fierce determination to build a life that felt full and visible and real, despite the physical weight she carried. She became a top-performing sales representative for a wellness brand, and she built a public presence on social media that documented her family's life with genuine warmth and unmistakable love. The girls were at the center of everything she shared publicly. They were at the center of everything she was privately. Bella Nicole Watts was born on December 17, 2013. She was 4 years old when she died. Everyone who knew her described a child of extraordinary presence. Bright, funny, full of an energy that her mother clearly recognized as her own. She was the kind of 4-year-old who walked into spaces and changed them simply by being in them. Celeste Catherine Watts was born on July 17, 2015. She was 3 years old. Gentler than her sister in temperament, sweet and deeply affectionate, the kind of child who followed her big sister everywhere with complete and open trust. She called her father Daddy with an unguarded joy that the people who witnessed it have never forgotten. At the time of the murders, Shanann was approximately 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy the couple had already named Nico Lee Watts. The pregnancy had been announced publicly. Friends and followers knew. The due date was January 2019. He never came close to it. The financial pressure inside the Watts household was real and documented. Court records and financial filings from that period confirmed significant debt and foreclosure proceedings on their home in Frederick, Colorado. But behavioral analysts and investigators who examined this case thoroughly have consistently identified the financial situation as context rather than cause. The actual catalyst for what happened in August 2018 was something else entirely. In late June of that year, Chris Watts began a relationship with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. What the documented record shows about the weeks that followed is that he underwent a psychological transformation that people who interacted with him during that period later described as a kind of lightness, a distraction, a sense that he was somehow already elsewhere even when he was physically present. He had told Kessinger he was separated. He was not. He was living a parallel existence, outwardly the husband and father, inwardly already detached from that identity, with a speed that forensic behavioral analysts later described as consistent with a very specific psychological profile. One defined not by violence or obvious instability, but by an almost complete absence of genuine emotional integration. A person capable of appearing to be something he fundamentally was not. Shanann spent the final weeks of July and the first weeks of August 2018 in North Carolina with Bella and Celeste, visiting family. The couple had been in contact during that time, and the documented record, including messages reviewed by investigators, shows Shanann was navigating a marriage she knew was in serious trouble. She texted a close friend on the night of August 12th, expressing anxiety about returning home, about the distance she felt from her husband, about a situation she could sense was deteriorating without fully understanding why. She boarded a flight back to Colorado that evening. A neighbor's security camera captured her arriving home by rideshare vehicle in the early hours of August 13th, 2018. She was carrying luggage. She walked through the front door of her house. That camera footage represents the last documented visual record of Shanann Watts alive. What happened inside that house in the hours that followed is established by the confession Chris Watts ultimately provided to investigators after multiple versions of his account collapsed under forensic pressure. He and Shanann had a conversation in their bedroom. He strangled her to death in their bed while she was carrying their son. He then went to his daughter's rooms. Bella and Celeste were asleep. He smothered them. By morning, the family he had built with Shanann over 6 years was gone. He loaded the bodies into his truck. He drove to the Cervi 319 oil well site operated by Anadarko Petroleum, where he worked as a field operator. A location he knew, a location with legitimate professional access, a location far enough removed from the residential neighborhood where anyone might have seen him. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave near the site. The manner in which he disposed of his daughters has been documented by investigators and reported by credible outlets in terms that remain among the most disturbing details in the entire case record. It is sufficient to say that the method reflected not a moment of uncontrolled panic, but a deliberate, operational decision made by someone functioning with chilling composure. He returned home, he texted Shanann's phone. He contacted friends expressing apparent confusion about her whereabouts. And then he did something that a trained investigator watching footage of it years later would still describe as one of the more extraordinary performances in the documented history of this kind of case. He stood in front of his house, with cameras from local television stations pointed at him, and he talked about wanting his family back. His affect was flat. His eyes moved in ways that behavioral analysts later described as inconsistent with genuine distress. The press conference footage was reviewed almost immediately by law enforcement and is cited in investigative accounts as a significant early indicator that something was profoundly wrong with the account he was presenting. Nicole Atkinson, a close friend of Shanann's who had dropped her off that morning, raised the alarm when Shanann missed a prenatal appointment and stopped responding to messages. She went to the house. Her escalating concern drove the initial missing persons response. It was her persistence that brought law enforcement to that door. On August 15, 2018, Colorado Bureau of Investigation agents conducted a formal interview with Chris Watts. During that interview, investigators showed him security camera footage from a neighbor's property that documented his activities that morning. Watts then offered a second version of events. In that account, he claimed Shanann had killed the girls in front of him during an argument, that he had watched his daughters die at their mother's hands, and had then, in a rage he described as overwhelming, killed Shanann. He implicated his dead pregnant wife in the murders of their children. That account did not survive contact with the forensic evidence. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018. On November 6, 2018, he entered guilty pleas to all charges: first-degree murder of Shanann Watts, first-degree murder of Bella Watts, first-degree murder of Celeste Watts, first-degree murder of Ament, by unlawful termination of a pregnancy for the death of Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. On November 19, 2018, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive time on the tampering charges. He will never be released. That is not a possibility that exists within any version of the legal framework governing his case. What happened next received almost no serious coverage at the time, and it should have. Approximately 6 weeks after sentencing, barely a month and a half after those courtroom doors closed, the Colorado Department of Corrections made a decision that was treated as a procedural footnote and deserved to be treated as something far more significant. They moved Chris Watts out of the state entirely, over 1,000 miles away, to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. The official reason given was his safety. A spokesperson for the Colorado Department of Corrections confirmed that Watts had been transferred out of state due to security concerns related to his status as a high-profile offender. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections declined to confirm his location, citing the Interstate Corrections Compact, the mechanism that allows states to house inmates in other states' facilities when the originating state cannot adequately manage the security situation internally. Former corrections professionals who have spoken publicly about cases of this nature have been consistent on what that kind of transfer actually means in practice. Individuals convicted of crimes against children occupy the lowest position in the social hierarchy of any correctional facility, without exception. The hostility directed at them from other inmates is immediate, sustained, and severe. What the speed and distance of this particular transfer suggests, and what no official source has ever confirmed or denied clearly, is that the situation inside the Colorado system in those first 6 weeks had become unmanageable. That the safety concerns were not theoretical, that something was happening inside those walls during that initial period that made the authorities decide they could not keep him there. They said nothing further. That question has never been resolved publicly. What has been documented, carefully and over time, is what happened after he arrived at Dodge. But to understand that documentation properly, you first need to understand where he arrived. Dodge Correctional Institution was not always a prison. Before it housed inmates, it functioned as a state psychiatric hospital. Its original name was the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. The walls of that facility have held some of the most notorious figures in Wisconsin's and the country's criminal history. Ed Gein, whose crimes in Plainfield, Wisconsin, in the 1950s became the factual foundation for some of the most disturbing fictional characters in American cultural history, the basis for Norman Bates, for Hannibal Lecter, for Buffalo Bill, was evaluated and held within those walls. Stephen Avery, whose case generated a global conversation through a documentary series watched by millions, passed through the same corridors. Dodge Correctional Institution exists specifically to contain the individuals that society has classified as its most dangerous, most irredeemable, most permanently beyond reach. Chris Watts, former oil field operator from Frederick, Colorado, former husband, former father of 2 little girls and an unborn son, has been one of them for over 7 years. Picture the space where he lives. Approximately 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete floor. A metal bunk bolted to the wall. A steel toilet with no privacy screen. One small window, reinforced with layered glass and wire mesh that looks out onto more concrete. Overhead lighting that does not differentiate between 7 in the morning and 10 at night. The same artificial brightness. The same flat, unchanging illumination at every hour of the day and night. That is where Chris Watts spends 23 hours of every single day. The remaining hour, if his conduct that specific day has earned it, is spent outside the cell in a controlled and limited environment. Then, the door closes again. Meals arrive through a slot in the door. He does not go to a cafeteria. He does not sit across a table from another human being and share a meal. The slot opens. The tray appears. The slot closes. That is the transaction. Birthdays happen inside that cell. Holidays. The anniversaries of things he cannot stop thinking about. Every single day is structurally identical to the one before it and the one that follows. There is no weekend. There is no event on any calendar that changes what any given Tuesday looks like, sounds like, or feels like. There is no variation. There is nothing new. Here is where this stops being about punishment and starts being about documented science. Because what that environment does to the human brain has been studied, measured, and recorded in peer-reviewed research for decades. And the findings do not accommodate moral preferences. The brain does not distinguish between a person who deserves to be in that cell and a person who does not. It responds to conditions. It responds to absence. And what it does, under the sustained absence of novelty, social contact, and environmental variation, has been documented with clinical precision. The first thing to deteriorate is time perception. The brain requires new experiences to mark the passage of time accurately. Without novelty, without variation, hours and days become genuinely difficult to distinguish from one another. Weeks blur, months collapse. The internal clock stops working correctly because there is nothing for it to measure against. Then come perceptual disturbances. Individuals in extended isolation begin hearing sounds that are not present, voices, movements in the periphery. They perceive shifts in their visual field that do not correspond to anything real. Researchers describe this as stimulus hunger. The brain, deprived of external input, generating its own sensory data because the environment is providing none. Critically, the mind in this state cannot reliably distinguish between what it has manufactured and what is actually happening. Then mood disruption, not ordinary sadness, but a specific clinical variety of depression characterized by emotional flattening, the inability to feel anticipation, and the gradual erosion of what psychologists call future orientation. That is the capacity to imagine that tomorrow might be different from today, that anything ahead might be worth holding on to. Under sustained isolation, that capacity begins to die. Then cognitive decline, memory problems, difficulty concentrating, the slow deterioration of the neural networks responsible for social processing, the systems that allow a human being to read tone in a voice, to follow a conversational thread, to understand what another person is communicating beneath the surface of their words. These systems require practice. Without it, they break down in ways that are measurable, documented, and, at a certain threshold, irreversible. At the far end of extended isolation, paranoia, full breaks from reality, documented psychotic episodes in individuals with no prior history of psychosis, not people who were already unstable, but ordinary people whose minds, under the sustained pressure of complete isolation, simply fractured. The United Nations does not classify prolonged solitary confinement as severe punishment. They classify it as torture. Chris Watts has been living inside those conditions for over 7 years. The corrections officers who observe him daily have documented what that looks like in practice. The behavioral record is specific, and it deserves to be handled carefully rather than sensationally. His disciplinary record at Dodge Correctional includes multiple formal citations, unauthorized communication, unauthorized transfer of personal property, possession of contraband, and refusal to follow direct orders from corrections staff. On their own, those violations might appear unremarkable in a maximum security environment. But the violations are not the story. What those violations actually involved is the story. He was cited for transferring a collection of personal belongings to another inmate, a man named Dylan Tolman. Not weapons, not contraband of any security significance. His books, his hygiene products, his soap, his shampoo, his toothbrush, his underwear. Consider what it takes psychologically to surrender those items to another person. Inside a prison cell, these are not casual objects. They are the most intimate possessions a person in that environment has. The things that in a stripped-down world of concrete and steel constitute the last remaining markers of personal identity. Surrendering them is not a strategic prison maneuver. It is not someone working within a hierarchy to gain influence. It is someone purchasing proximity, paying for the sensation of genuine human connection with the only currency left, his most personal possessions, exchanged for the feeling, however distorted, that he mattered to someone. And it did not stop there. Watts had been placing phone calls to Tolman's family members on the outside. He reportedly enlisted his own parents, who were still occasionally in contact with him during that period, to reach out to Tolman's mother and girlfriend on his behalf. He was constructing an elaborate social network through another inmate's family, across state lines, simply to maintain the feeling of being connected to something beyond those walls. Building a proxy life through another person's relationships, because his own had been permanently severed by his own hand. Behavioral observers inside Dodge have also noted that he talks to himself, not quietly or occasionally, sustained one-sided conversations with no other participant present. Multiple individuals who have spent time in proximity to him inside the facility have noted this independently of each other. During actual conversations with people present, he loses the thread. His gaze fixes somewhere in the middle distance, and he goes somewhere else entirely, then attempts to re-enter the exchange as though the gap never happened. Sometimes resuming the exact sentence he had been building, sometimes beginning somewhere entirely unrelated, as though the conversation he left and the one he has returned to are, in his mind, the same. His personal hygiene has declined in ways that people familiar with who he was before incarceration find genuinely difficult to reconcile with the man they knew. In 2018, Chris Watts was described by those who knew him as meticulous about his appearance, careful, always well presented. Reports from sources inside Dodge over recent years describe someone who now sometimes goes multiple days without showering, even when access is available. That specific pattern, degraded self-care in someone previously fastidious about their appearance, is a documented clinical marker of severe depression compounded by cognitive decline. It appears in isolation research literature with consistent regularity. And then there is the detail that draws everything else into a single, coherent picture. Corrections officers conducting overnight rounds have reported seeing Chris Watts awake at 3 in the morning, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, not reading, not writing, not pacing, sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall, completely still for hours. When the brain receives no meaningful differentiation between daylight and darkness, no temperature variation across the day, no social cues anchoring the circadian rhythm, no external signals telling the body when to sleep and when to be awake, it loses the ability to regulate sleep architecture correctly. The biological systems governing rest become completely unmoored. The result is precisely what the people monitoring him have described: fragmented sleep and extended motionless wakefulness during the hours when the facility is locked down and silent. 7 years in, the behavioral changes being observed right now inside Dodge Correctional are not the end point of this process. They are a point on a trajectory that moves in only one direction. Now the letters. Because this is where something genuinely revealing enters the picture, something that the disciplinary record and the behavioral observations only partially prepared us for. Since renewed documentary attention brought the Watts case back into mainstream conversation through 2024 and into 2025, the volume of mail reaching him at Dodge has increased significantly. He has reportedly been receiving more correspondence than at any point since his first year of incarceration, and he responds to a substantial portion of it. His letters have been reviewed by journalists, discussed at length by people who have corresponded with him directly, and examined by forensic behavioral specialists. What they reveal is a pattern, consistent, clinically recognizable, and deeply telling. On the surface, the letters contain what accountability sounds like. He acknowledges responsibility. He references carrying the weight of what happened. He writes about Shanann, about Bella, about Celeste, about Nico. He uses the language of remorse, the words that in another context, from another person, might signal genuine reckoning with an unbearable truth. And then, within the same letter, sometimes within the same paragraph, sometimes within just a few sentences of that acknowledgement, the framing quietly shifts. The marriage had complications that outsiders could not fully see. There were pressures that shaped him in ways people on the outside could not understand. Certain relationships changed his sense of who he was. The full picture, he insists, is more complex than what the public record reflects. That phrase, the full picture, appears in his correspondence repeatedly, threading through conversations he has had with people inside Dodge and through letters sent to people he has never met. Forensic psychologists have documented this pattern extensively across individuals serving permanent sentences, people with no practical incentive to reshape their narrative for any official audience, people who are never getting out and have nothing strategic to gain from how they present themselves. The pattern persists anyway. It is called mitigation narrative construction, and it is not unique to Watts. It is not necessarily evidence of calculated manipulation. It is what the mind does when holding the complete, unfiltered truth of what was done in a closed environment over years, with no relief and nowhere to set it down, becomes psychologically unsustainable. The brain builds scaffolding around that truth to make continued existence alongside it possible, not always to deceive others, because the alternative, holding it fully, plainly, without any surrounding framework, is something a deteriorating mind simply cannot sustain. A prison source cited by a major national publication reported that Watts spends the majority of his commissary budget not on food, not on books, but on stamps and paper, every week, year after year, writing to women he has never met, in places he will never go, building relationships that exist entirely on paper. That single verified detail communicates something about the current state of his psychology that years of standard coverage has not managed to capture with the same clarity. The obsessive attachment pattern that behavioral analysts identified as central to the psychology behind August 13, 2018, the consuming need for emotional connection, documented in research into his case, did not end with the crime. It was not contained by the sentence. It is active right now in that cell, expressed through letters sent to strangers across the country. And the letters themselves are not casual. Everyone who has reviewed them closely says the same thing. The emotional intensity inside them escalates quickly. According to the account of the individual who spent the most documented time in direct proximity to him at Dodge, these written relationships are not something Watts engages in alongside his daily existence. They are his daily existence. By his own expressed framing, they are what makes continued survival inside that facility feel possible. What that pattern reveals, what a statement he reportedly wrote in late 2025 contains, and the question that all of it, the isolation, the deterioration, the letters, the mitigation narrative, the clinical trajectory, forces us to confront, that is exactly where this goes next. There is a clinical term for what the letters reveal, not a vague description, not an impression formed by reading between the lines, but a precisely defined psychological pattern that forensic attachment researchers have documented across decades of behavioral study. It is called anxious enmeshed attachment, and understanding what it actually means is the only way to fully grasp what is unfolding inside that cell in Wisconsin right now. Forensic attachment researchers describe this pattern as one characterized by total reliance on another person as the primary mechanism for emotional self-regulation. The individual operating within this pattern cannot manage their internal emotional state independently. They require the consuming, reciprocated presence of another person to function with basic psychological stability. When that presence is stable, the individual stabilizes alongside it. When it becomes uncertain, when the other person introduces distance or ambiguity, the response is not recalibration. It is not measured adjustment. It is immediate, disproportionate, total crisis. Multiple behavioral analysts identified this precise dynamic as the governing psychological structure of Chris Watts in the period leading up to August 2018. His relationship with Shannon, his relationship with Nicole Kessinger, the way both connections operated, not as components of his life, but as the scaffolding holding the entire psychological structure upright. The need for consuming reciprocated attachment, the inability to self-regulate without it. The way that perceived instability in either relationship produced not a measured response, but complete destabilization. That pattern did not end when the courtroom doors closed. It did not dissolve behind the walls of Dodge Correctional Institution. The stamps and paper detail confirms it is still running, every week, year after year, against the only material now available to it, paper. The names of people he has never been in the same room with. That is not a changed man. That is the identical psychological architecture that produced the worst morning in the Watts family's history, operating in the only environment it now has access to. What makes that clinically significant beyond this individual case is what it reveals about the relationship between extended isolation and genuine psychological transformation. Most people assume that years of confinement, surrounded by nothing but time and consequences, eventually produce someone fundamentally different at their core. That the weight of what was done, carried long enough in a small enough space, reshapes the person carrying it. The evidence from Dodge points towards something considerably more disturbing. The core patterns are not dissolving under the pressure of incarceration. They are intensifying, running harder and more completely because the ordinary complexity of daily life that once diluted and partially managed them has been stripped away entirely. There is no career, no family dynamic, no social environment, no external structure left to absorb any of it. There is nothing for those patterns to run against except other people's letters, and so that is what they run against, completely, without the friction of a real world around them. and without any apparent awareness of how transparently that reveals the unchanging nature of what was always underneath. Now we arrive at the statement itself. In correspondence from this period, letters described by those who reviewed them as increasingly desperate and emotionally unguarded, Watts reportedly reached a point where the psychological accumulation had become, in his own framing, unbearable. He wrote about sitting inside that cell, with silence pressing in from every direction, about memories returning in waves he could not control and could not redirect. Family dinners, the sound of his daughters laughing, ordinary evenings at home that at the time they were happening would have seemed entirely unremarkable, forgettable moments that inside that cell, with nothing else to occupy the silence, cannot be set aside, cannot be interrupted, cannot be escaped. He wrote about the feeling of being trapped, not just physically, but in a way that was specifically and uniquely mental. That prison had taken his freedom and handed him something in return that he had not fully anticipated. Endless broken time that always circled back to the same place, without exception, without relief, always. And then the words that reportedly appeared in his writing, the words that stopped everyone who read them. 4 words: I cannot live here anymore. Before going any further, the immediate reaction those words produce in most people who have followed this case deserves to be named honestly. For a significant portion of the audience that has spent any time with this story, the instinctive response to that statement is something close to satisfaction. He should feel that. He built that cell himself through deliberate, calculated choices that ended 4 lives. The suffering is not incidental to the sentence. It is the sentence. That response is not wrong. It is human. It is understandable. It is exactly what Frank Razuchek, Shanann's father, gave voice to when he stood at that sentencing and told Chris Watts directly that he wanted him to see what he had done every time he closed his eyes. But here is the question the clinical literature raises, the question that almost no coverage of this case has been willing to sit with. Is what Watts is expressing in that statement the weight of genuine moral reckoning finally breaking through the surface after 7 years? Or is it something the isolation research has a different and far more disturbing name for? Because at a certain point in the progression of severe extended isolation, the human brain loses the capacity to hold 2 incompatible things simultaneously. Specifically, it loses the ability to hold what it knows to be factually true alongside what it cannot psychologically survive, accepting as fully, completely, and irreversibly true. What that produces clinically is not dramatic collapse, not the visible breakdown people imagine when they picture a man in a cell finally confronting what he did. It is something quieter, a fracturing, a slow divergence between the words a person uses and the complete moral weight those words are actually supposed to carry. Those 4 words, written by a man serving 5 consecutive life sentences, deserve to be examined with precision. The question is not whether he is suffering, he is. That is documented, observable, and entirely consistent with what his environment is designed to produce. The question is what he believes he cannot live with, whether the specific, intact moral weight of why he is there, the full and unfiltered understanding of what he took, and from whom, and what it meant, is still completely present inside that suffering. Or whether the isolation has already begun doing what the research describes at this duration, separating the raw experience of punishment from the coherent, fully connected understanding of what that punishment is actually for. Then came the late 2025 correspondence, reported by a major national publication in early 2026, drawn from letters dated across the final months of that year. Chris Watts wrote to a pen pal that God had placed him in prison deliberately, that his incarceration was not the consequence of choices he had made, but divine will, part of a larger plan he was being prepared for and called toward. And then he drew a direct comparison between his own imprisonment and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The immediate response to that is outrage. The outrage is entirely understandable. It is the first thing any reasonable person feels upon encountering it. But the more significant response, the one grounded in what this actually reveals about where his mind exists in 2026, is clinical rather than emotional. According to his own detailed confession given to investigators during his incarceration, Chris Watts planned and executed the murders of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and their unborn son Nico. He strangled Shanann in their marital home. He drove Bella and Celeste to a remote oil field worksite after an earlier attempt had not killed them. He submerged their small bodies in crude oil storage tanks on that property. He then returned home, and the following morning stood in front of that same house on local television, speaking into a camera, pleading publicly for his family's safe return. That man, the man who did those things in that sequence, is the man sitting in a Wisconsin cell in 2026, comparing his experience of incarceration to the suffering of Jesus Christ. This is not exceptional narcissism, performing deliberately for an audience. This is not a calculating mind doing something it knows is outrageous and choosing to do it anyway. This is precisely what the clinical literature predicts for someone at this specific stage of psychological deterioration under prolonged isolation. The self-protective reframing of one's own suffering as cosmically significant, as divinely ordained, as part of a plan larger than the individual, and therefore meaningful in a way that raw, uncontextualized, fully held guilt simply cannot be. Because holding the unvarnished reality, without that framework, without the narrative scaffolding carefully built around it, has become psychologically impossible to sustain from inside that cell. The man sentenced in November 2018 is not the man sitting in that cell today, not because he has grown or changed or arrived at anything resembling genuine redemption, but because the environment specifically designed to deliver his punishment has altered the architecture of his mind in ways the research literature describes as largely irreversible at this duration. That is what corrections officers mean when they say he is not normal anymore. Not dramatic collapse, not the breakdown people picture. A quiet, progressive, documented unraveling. There is a dimension of his daily existence at Dodge that has been almost entirely absent from coverage of this case, and it matters significantly to understanding what his life inside that facility actually involves on a practical level. Prison operates on two simultaneous hierarchies. The official one, determined by the institution and reflected in housing assignments, privilege levels, and disciplinary standing, and the unofficial one, the code that every person who enters a correctional facility understands within days of arrival, without anyone stating it explicitly, without any formal instruction. At the upper levels of the unofficial hierarchy sit inmates whose crimes the prison population finds at least comprehensible, if not acceptable. Gang-related violence, armed robbery, drug trafficking at significant scale. There is a form of grudging recognition available within prison culture for certain categories of offense, an acknowledgement of the world and circumstances that produce them, even without approval of the actions themselves. You move downward, as the offenses become increasingly intolerable to that population, and at the absolute bottom, consistent across facility types, across states, across decades of documented research into prison social dynamics, are people who harm children. That category carries a specific and unambiguous weight inside correctional facilities that no other class of offense carries. Because a significant proportion of the men serving time in any given maximum security facility are fathers. They have children on the outside. They carry photographs they look at when no one else is watching. They are counting days, months, and years toward however remote the possibility might be of seeing those children again. Those children are the thing that makes the sentence survivable, the thing that gives the calendar meaning. When those men encounter someone who had exactly what they miss most intensely, a family that was intact, children who were alive and loved him, a life that was real and functioning, and his, and destroyed all of it, not under survival pressure, not in a desperate moment of crisis, but through calculated, premeditated, sequential action. The response is not analytical. It is not distant or philosophical. It is immediate. It is personal. It requires no coordination and no discussion. It simply exists. Chris Watts has occupied the bottom of that hierarchy from the moment he arrived at Dodge. Documented accounts from former inmates who served time in proximity to him are consistent on this point. Without corrections officers in direct physical proximity, he faces danger. Every movement through that facility, every moment outside that cell, he moves with the knowledge that his physical safety depends entirely on staff being exactly where they need to be at exactly the right moment. He moves with his head down. He avoids any space that is not closely monitored. He chooses to remain in the cell over a common area whenever the option exists. That is not preference. That is a survival calculation made dozens of times each day. The inability to fully lower the guard, the way that sustained, unbroken alertness compounds every other stressor simultaneously. The isolation, the sleep disruption, the cognitive erosion, each one feeding and accelerating the others in a compounding cycle that has no relief point and no pause. That is his world. Every morning he wakes into it. Every night it is completely unchanged. Now the question this entire examination has been building toward, the question grounded entirely in documented science that mainstream coverage of this case has not been willing to confront directly. Extended isolation does not have a stabilization point. The research is consistent across study populations and across decades of inquiry. The longer the exposure, the more severe and the more irreversible the cognitive and psychological damage becomes. There is a specific threshold documented in the isolation literature where the subject is no longer experiencing their punishment in a fully coherent, fully connected sense. Not because they no longer know they are in prison. Watts knows he is in prison. He will always know that. But because the cognitive capacity required to hold cause alongside consequence, to maintain the specific, intact connection between the choices he made and what those choices permanently produced, begins to fragment under the sustained pressure of isolation stress. When that fragmentation reaches a certain depth, the person inside the cell is no longer fully experiencing accountability in the way the sentence was designed to deliver it. They are experiencing the mechanical repetition of identical days. The slot in the door. The same wall. The same flat, unchanging light at 4 in the morning. But the specific moral weight that makes those conditions meaningful as punishment, the targeted, coherent, intact understanding of why, becomes increasingly difficult to sustain as the mind continues its deterioration. Frank Rzucek stood at that sentencing and said he hoped Watts would see what he had done every time he closed his eyes. That was the expressed desire of a father who lost his daughter, his grandchildren, and an unborn grandson to deliberate violence. It was honest. It was human. It was exactly what justice was supposed to produce in the person responsible for that loss. The clinical evidence around prolonged isolation suggests that the capacity to carry that vision coherently and completely, with its full moral weight fully intact, may not survive 3 more decades of what Dodge Correctional is currently delivering. Let this be stated with absolute clarity. Nothing in this examination is an argument for altering his sentence in any direction. 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole is exactly where Chris Watts belongs, without qualification, without caveat, without any hesitation whatsoever. What is being examined here is the gap, the significant, disturbing, and largely unexamined gap between what most people imagine long-term maximum security isolation does to a human mind and what the documented science shows it actually produces across a decade and beyond. The corrections officers describe the changes in behavioral terms their professional language allows. The self-talk, the mid-sentence dissociation, the 4 in the morning wall staring, the toothbrush exchange, the letter comparing his imprisonment to crucifixion. These are not the behaviors of a man processing his punishment clearly and carrying its full weight in the way Frank Razuchek stood up and asked for. These are the behaviors of a man whose mind is being systematically dismantled by the very conditions designed to hold him accountable. And that distinction between what punishment is designed to do and what prolonged isolation is documented to actually produce is what the people inside Dodge are observing in real time. He is 40 years old. He has been inside Dodge Correctional Institution for over 7 years. If he lives to average male life expectancy, approximately 36 more years remain inside that facility, 36 more years of the slot in the door. The overhead light that registers no difference between morning and midnight, the 23 hours, the same wall at 4 in the morning, the same silence that his brain has been learning to fill with its own distorted content for the better part of a decade. The behavioral trajectory documented across his incarceration does not point toward stabilization. The clinical literature is unambiguous on this point. The processes set in motion by extended isolation continue in one direction. The cognitive deterioration continues. The perceptual fragmentation continues. The erosion of coherent self-reflection continues. Research suggests that within the next decade, possibly sooner, given what has already accumulated, there may come a point where Watts cannot sustain a coherent conversation, where the letters stop being internally organized even to himself, where the obsessive relational attachments that currently provide his inner life with its only remaining structure become impossible to maintain because the psychological capacity required to sustain them has degraded past any functional threshold. And when that happens, when the man in that cell has deteriorated past coherent self-awareness, 5 life sentences will still be running. The door will remain closed. The slot will open with the tray and close again. But the interior experience that gives those sentences their meaning as punishment, the specific intact conscious understanding of why he is there and what he took from the world to earn that place, will have been progressively dismantled by the same conditions designed to deliver it. That is what the corrections officers at Dodge are describing when they say he is not the same anymore. Before this closes, there is something it would be morally incomplete to leave out. Everything examined here, the behavioral changes, the disciplinary record, the letters, the prison social hierarchy, the isolation science, the question of what punishment actually means as the years accumulate, all of it only carries weight in reference to 4 people who had absolutely no say in what was done to them. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She had built a life and documented it with generosity and genuine warmth, and loved it without apology. She had a business she believed in, a home she was proud of, 2 daughters she was fully present with in a way that everything she left behind makes impossible to misread. She was 15 weeks pregnant on the morning of August 13, 2018. She had a prenatal appointment scheduled for that very day, arranged specifically to learn the gender of the son she already planned to name Nico. She had been looking forward to that appointment. She never made it. Bella was 4 years old. The morning her father loaded her into the back of his truck was supposed to be the first day of school. She had a backpack. Her parents had spoken to her about it. She had gone to sleep the previous night, carrying whatever a 4-year-old carries in her imagination about tomorrow. The particular anticipation of something that has never happened before and that she had been told was coming. Celeste was 3, old enough to have a personality that was entirely and recognizably her own. Old enough to have specific relationships with the world and with the specific people in it. Old enough that the people who loved her will spend the rest of their lives encountering her unexpectedly, in ordinary moments they were not prepared for. A particular sound, a phrase, a specific kind of laugh, and having to absorb that. Nico never had his name spoken to his face, never drew a breath outside his mother's body, never had a first day of anything, or a last day of anything, or any day at all. When this channel examines what is happening inside that cell in Wisconsin, what guards are observing year by year, what the letters reveal beneath the surface, what the research projects across the decades ahead, all of it is done in service of understanding what those 4 lives meant and what their permanent, irreversible absence requires from the people who are still here and still paying attention. Not what his suffering means as an independent subject. Not what happens to Chris Watts as an object of interest removed from what he destroyed. Their absence is the only reason any of this conversation is necessary. That is the only reason. If this gave you something real, something grounded, something you have not found in the standard coverage of this case, then please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone who follows cases like this one carefully. The depth of research that goes into content at this level takes significant time and resources to produce, and every share places it in front of people who genuinely care about these stories being told responsibly. This is DAV Crime Records. If you are not already subscribed, hit that button and turn on notifications right now, because this channel is not finished with this case. There are questions from 2018 that remain completely open in 2026, and every single one of them is going to be examined with source documents in hand. Subscribe so you are there when it drops. For Shanann, for Bella, for Celeste, and for Nico, who never had a single day. Justice is not a moment, it is a direction, and this channel is not done moving toward it.